narrative of armed resistance, non-Laban, planting of drugs and weapons, and the absence of genuine investigation demonstrates a systematic attack. This pattern is not a coincidence, it is structured. The use of similar operational narrative and particular assertions of armed resistance demonstrate consistency incompatible with isolated acts. Regardless of whether the direct perpetrators were formally identified as police officers, the similar tactics used show planning and coordination involving law enforcement authorities and, at times, local officials. Killings were not carried out by rogue officials or by vigilantes operating separately from the authorities. The police involvement in the killings extended well beyond the cases officially acknowledged as death arising from by-bust operations. Furthermore, the government failure to arrest, let alone prosecute, a single police officer for their role in any of the war on drug killings that Duterte has encouraged, sent a clear message that the one responsible need not fear accountability and can act with impunity. There is no evidence that Mr. Duterte took any steps to prevent or punish the responsible for the murders. On the contrary, as his numerous public statements made clear, he discounted the legality of police actions, showing no inclination or intent to investigate alleged crimes. Mr. Duterte encouraged the police to carry out his anti-drug campaign and repeatedly stated he would protect them from prosecution. On 19 July 2016, at a fellowship dinner with his former law school classmates, Mr. Duterte said the police officer could carry out their war on drugs without worrying about being prosecuted. He stated, and I quote, "The president can grant pardon, conditional or absolute, or grant amnesty with the concurrence of Congress. I will use it, believe me," end of quote. During a press conference on 21st August 2016, he also explained that his promises to protect the police was one of the reasons why the war on drugs had become so bloody, and I quote, "Remember, I went in warning everyone. I said it could be bloody because I knew that the police would now be equipped with a certain mindset, that they would be protected by law if they go in and have this, violent confrontation. Because before, they were afraid of these human rights, and a lot of them lost their jobs because they couldn't even have a lawyer to defend themselves," end of quote. Mr. Duterte also warned human rights organizations not to file cases against police and army officers for extrajudicial killings, saying, and I quote, "I would like to say now they will never go to prison, not under my watch," end of quote. This morning, Your Honor, Mr. Jeremy referred to the killing of the mayor of Albuera, Rolando Espinosa, who was killed inside the Leyte prison. At the time, the National Bureau of Investigation determined that the killings were a rub-out of two unarmed prisoners inside their cell and filed murder charges. Mr. Duterte responding, saying that the officers would not be prosecuted with these words, and I will quote, "I will not allow this," meaning officers, "go to prison. I don't care if the NBA says it is murder. Anyway, the NBA and the Department of Justice are both under my authority. I will be the one to answer for it and go to prison," end of quote. On his third day in office as president, Mr. Duterte publicly told police officers that he would pardon them if they kill drug dealers and drug addicts, using these words, quote, "Do your duty. And if in the process you kill 1,000 persons because you're doing your duty, I will protect you," end of quote. Given the prevailing perception of police impunity and the absence of effective investigations or prosecutions, in many cases, victims did not file a complaint nor try to initiate criminal proceedings. As one family member of a victim explained to us, and I quote, "We had no hope for an investigation of the police. One of us saw one of the police go inside with an aluminum briefcase. He took out a gun and some shabu socket and placed them next to the body. I went back to where I was, and I was totally shocked. I couldn't even complain. If we go complain, what is our chance against the authorities?" End of quote. In other cases, victims tried to seek justice. They went to the police, to local officials, to government agencies. They filed reports, they asked for investigation, they begged for answers, but their pleas were ignored, their complaints were dismissed, their testimonies were doubted. In some cases, the very people they approached for help were the same ones involved in the violence. They were left with no path forward. No institution was willing to hear them. No authority was willing to protect them. No system was willing to acknowledge what was happening. The attack against the civilian population was carried out pursuant to a state policy to neutralize, through violent crimes, including murder, individuals perceived or alleged to be involved in drug-related and other crimes. The policy was originally developed by Mr. Duterte and his close associates in Davao City and implemented locally, and then expanding to the national level in 2016, once Mr. Duterte became President of the Republic of the Philippines. Victims support the primary prosecution pleading and submit that the evidence shows the existence of such a policy as reflected in the repeated patterns of conduct, the mobilization of state resources, Mr. Duterte's public endorsement, and institutional tolerance. Mr. Duterte first ran for mayor of Davao in 1988 on a campaign to restore law and order in the city, the largest of the main southern island of Mindanao. At that time, Davao was known as the murder capital of the Philippines. Communist insurgents and government security forces gunned each other down and many civilians day and night on Davao streets and barrios. Mr. Duterte was Davao mayor for most of the years between 1988 and 2016. Local NGOs indicate that squad killings of alleged drug dealers, petty criminals, and street children in Davao City started sometimes in the mid-90s, during Mr. Duterte's second term. The group that claimed to be responsible for the killings was called Suruguan Sakatuan, or Servants of the People, amongst other names. But soon the media, as you have also heard in these days, the media began referring to it as the Davao Death Squad. The Davao Death Squad killed hundreds. Mr. Duterte endorsed the killings as an effective way to combat crime, relishing his Duterte nickname and reputation. His active promotion of the killing of suspected drug offenders led to a sharp increase in such killings during his time as mayor. According to one estimate, amongst the other that you have been shown yesterday and today, at least 1,424 such killings took place in Davao between 1988 and 2015. As you heard yesterday during the presentation of Mr. Nichols, And today, during the presentation of Ms. Croft, when confronted with a death toll during his presidential election campaign, Mr. Duterte responded, "They said I killed 700? They undercounted. It was 1,700. As you also heard, Your Honors, on numerous occasions as mayor, Mr. Duterte claimed personal responsibility for the policy of killing drug suspects. Even prior to announcing his candidacy for the May 2016 presidential election, Mr. Duterte was already very clear about his intention to eliminate crime by eliminating criminals, applying nationwide the abusive crime control tactics. As reported in the Sunstar Philippines on 24 May 2015, he declared, and I quote, "If by chance that God will place me there, watch out, because the 1,000, referring to the person killed in Davao, because the 1,000 will become 100,000. You will see the fish in Manila Bay getting fat. That is where I will dump you." End of quote. 3 months after that speech, he renewed his pledge, and I quote, "If I become president, you better hide. That 1,000 will reach 50,000. I would kill all of you who make the lives of Filipinos miserable." End of quote. Mr. Duterte's outspoken vote to embark on a nationwide killing campaign against drug dealers and drug users was the foundation of his presidential electoral platform. During a campaign rally on 15 March 2016, he stated, quote, "When I become president, I will order the police to find those people dealing or using drugs and kill them. The funeral parlors will be packed." Following his election as president, as also explained this morning by Mr. Jeremy, on 9 May 2016, Mr. Duterte continued to declare unequivocally that his anti-drug campaign was focused on killing drug dealers and users. Speaking in Davao on 4 June 2016, he stated, quote, "If you are still into drugs, I'm going to kill you. Don't take this as a joke. I'm not trying to make you laugh, son of bitches. I will really kill you." End of quote. The next month, Mr. Duterte referred to children killed in his drug war as, I quote, "collateral damage." Mr. Duterte and his associates disregarded the most basilar principle of law, human rights, and human dignity. In September 2016, after the then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon denounced the drug war killings, Mr. Duterte called him a fool, adding, quote, "I will continue the campaign against the criminals. I do not have any pity for them. I don't give a shit. I am the president of the Philippines, not the Republic of the international community." End of quote. In a Human Rights Watch report issued in March 2017, Mr. Duterte's first 6 months in office were labeled as a human rights calamity for the Philippines. Mr. Duterte repeated public statements encouraging the killing of alleged drug offenders were not rhetorical flourishes. They were operational directives. The repeated calls to kill alleged drug dealers and users is indicative of a government policy to direct an attack against a specific civilian population. Public statements encourage lethal force. Law enforcement operations were organized and resourced. The rhetoric of eradication was translated into practice. The scale, coordination, and continuity of operations, coupled with public encouragement of lethal enforcement, support the inference of policy. When violence is normalized, repeated, and institutionally defended, as in the present case, it reflects policy. Turning to the alleged liability of Mr. Duterte. The suspect is charged as indirect co-perpetrator under Article 25(3)(a) for committing the crimes jointly with others in furtherance of a common plan or agreement to neutralize through violent crimes including murder, individual perceived or alleged to be involved in drug-related and other crimes. In the alternative, he is also charged under Article 25(3)(b) for ordering or inducing the Davao Death Squad and later the national network to commit the crimes, and under Article 25(3)(c) for aiding, abetting, or otherwise assisting members of the Davao Death Squad and later the national network to commit the crimes. Victims submit that the evidence presented by the prosecution allows to conclude that there are substantial grounds to believe that Mr. Duterte is criminally responsible for the crimes charged. In particular, the evidence shows the existence of a common plan to kill individuals perceived by the authorities as implicated in drug-related crimes. The common plan originated in Davao in the late 80s when the suspect instructed members of the death squad, police officers and non-police hitmen, to conduct operations against the targeted individuals, provided funds and other resources to achieve the aim of the agreement. As already recalled, Mr. Duterte made unequivocal public statements encouraging police and civilians to kill alleged drug offenders. Such statements indicate an intent to use the country's law enforcement agencies to engage in murders. Mr. Duterte was proud of his achievements at the point that he put his method at the center of his presidential campaign. When elected president, he adopted the same method as in Davao nationwide and continued to state publicly and unequivocally that his anti-drug campaign would focus on killing drug dealers and users. Mr. Duterte relied on the support of the police, which he exercised effective control over, to execute the common plan. Their loyalty was reinforced through financial incentives, promotions, and the maintenance of a system of impunity. Mr. Duterte had full knowledge of the crimes. As the Chamber has already heard, on 15 March 2016 in Lingayen, he announced that if elected, he would order police to locate and kill individuals involved in drugs, warning that funeral parlors would be crowded. On 7 May 2016, the final day of the campaigning for the presidential elections, Mr. Duterte made it clear that his threats were to be taken literally, and I quote, "All of you who are into drugs, you sons of bitches, I will really kill you. I have no patience, I have no middle ground," end of quote. Madam President, Your Honors, the loss victims carry is not measured only in the death of a loved one. It is measured in the empty chair at the dinner table, the birthdays that will never be celebrated, the dreams that ended abruptly, and the futures that were taken from them. As one of the victims put it, and I quote, "My loved one was not perfect. None of us are. But he was a human being. He was someone's child, someone's parent, someone's partner. He deserved dignity, due process, and the chance to defend himself. Instead, his life ended without warning, without explanation, and without accountability. For many of us, the moment we learned of our loved one's death was the moment our own lives changed forever. We were left with questions that no one in authority would answer. We were left with fear that speaking out would put us in danger. And we were left with a painful knowledge that the institutions meant to protect us had failed us. End of quote. The trauma of these events did not end with the loss of life. It continues every day. Families were left to navigate grief while facing stigma and suspicion. Many were told implicitly or explicitly that their loved ones had deserved what happened to them. They were made to feel ashamed for seeking answers. Some were threatened when they tried to file complaints. Others were told not to bother because nothing would come of it. Children witness violence now struggle with fear. Parents who lost their children live with enduring guilt and despair. Entire communities still carry the memory of nights filled of sirens, shouting, and uncertainty. Your Honors, the victim's suffering is never abstract nor remote. It remains real, immediate, and ongoing. Your Honors, trauma is not always visible. It resides in the silence of the ones who are afraid to speak. It lives in the hesitation of a child who no longer feels safe walking outside, and in the constant fear of families who still look over their shoulders, wondering whether they will be targeted next. For the victims, the confirmation of charges is not merely a legal step. It is a recognition that their loved ones mattered. It is an acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong. It is a message that they have not been forgotten. These proceedings offer something they had been denied in years: hope. Hope that the truth will be established, that the one responsible will be held to account, that future generations will not endure the same suffering. Justice cannot restore their loved ones, but it can restore dignity. Justice can affirm humanity. Justice can help them begin to heal. Madam President, Your Honors, for the purpose of a confirmation of a charges hearing, the prosecution must demonstrate substantial grounds to believe that Mr. Duterte committed each of the crimes charged. Victims submit that the evidence presented by the prosecution meets this evidentiary standard. The confirmation of all charges is not only legally warranted, it is essential to the integrity of international criminal justice. The evidence before this chamber establishes reasonable ground to believe that crimes against humanity of murder and attempted murder were committed in the context of a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population, and that Mr. Duterte bears individual and criminal responsibility under Article 25 of the Rome Statute. Your Honors, the victims have waited years for this moment. They have been silenced, stigmatized, and denied justice in their own country. Today, they stand before you with the hope that justice, long denied, may finally be within reach. This court is their last refuge, and today, on their behalf, we ask this chamber to affirm that their suffering matters, that their rights matter, and that the rule of law extends even to the most powerful, by confirming all the charges against Mr. Duterte and committing him to trial. This concludes my part, Your Honors. With your leave, I will give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Andres, for concluding our presentation. Merci beaucoup.
Judge Motoch, thank you very much. Metro Andres, you have the floor.
Madam President, Your Honors, I am Gilbert Andres. My colleague Ms. Masida earlier submitted that Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign disproportionately affected the poor and marginalized. What were the conditions of the victims targeted by Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign? How poor and marginalized were his victims? The victims targeted by Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign were from low-income, high-density communities. In an urban setting, this meant that some victims live in an area of about 69,000 persons per square kilometer during the relevant period. A typical floor area of the house of a victim in these high-density communities was about 6 square meters. For some victims, their house was as small as the area of 2 tables in this courtroom. The victims' houses were typically made up of wood, used tarpaulin, plastic, light materials, and some broken hollow blocks. Any material that they could scavenge and utilize. As the victims lived in high-density communities, their neighbors knew them very well. The victims lived in close-knit communities. The victims' close-knit communities meant that they immediately knew if a person was an outsider to their community. And any traumatic event that happened to these victims in their close-knit communities was known and whispered throughout their community. As the victims were from low-income communities, to survive poverty, their houses were homes to multiple generations of their families to conserve their meager resources. For Filipinos, especially from low-income communities, their family is not just the nuclear family. It is not just the husband, the wife, the children. Their family extends to the grandparents, the lolo and lola, and the siblings of a spouse, the brothers and sisters. The breadwinner of the victim's family was usually the husband, the father of the children. The victims either worked as daily minimum wage earners or as wage earners below the prescribed daily minimum wage, or as part of the informal economy, such as a vendor. The victims worked if there was work available to earn for their family's survival. But most of the victims would not have completed their education, nor have the proper training to secure stable jobs as part of the formal economy. If they were fortunate to be employed as minimum daily wage earners, in the urban setting, this amounted to about 500 Philippine pesos per day, or approximately about 8 euros per day during the relevant period. But for most victims, the minimum wage was really the maximum that they can hope for. The victims only hope to earn at most about 8 euros per day. And for a family composed of the husband, the wife, and about 2 until 4 children, 8 euros per day is meager. There was also a cultural expectation for the breadwinners to help their elderly parents. The other spouse sometimes augmented this meager income by being a vendor or by taking temporary jobs. And if both parents were outside of their home, it was the extended family that took care of the children. Your Honors, the specific data may vary from victim to victim, but the victims hope that this data give the chamber a picture of their conditions under Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign. The already marginalized and vulnerable conditions of the victims exponentially multiplied the harm that they suffered, and they continue to suffer, which leads to our next submission. What were the grave effects and suffered harm of the victims, their families, and their communities resulting from the crimes charged against Mr. Duterte? Mr. Duterte's drug war campaign targeted the very humanity of the victims, of their families, and of their communities. In Filipino, the indirect victims expressed this in one sentence: "Inalisan kami ng dangal. We were stripped of our dignity." How so? First, Mr. Duterte publicly dehumanized the victims of his anti-drug campaign. This dehumanization of the victims was used to justify their eventual murders. On July 25, 2016, during his first State of the Nation address before the Philippine Congress, Mr. Duterte declared that, and I quote, "But human rights cannot be used as a shield or an excuse to destroy the country, your country, and my country." End of quote. What was chilling was that this portion of Mr. Duterte's speech garnered the most applause from members of the Philippine Congress and the public gallery. On August 17, 2016, during the 115th Police Service Anniversary at the Philippine National Police Headquarters, Mr. Duterte declared to the Philippine National Police that for those allegedly affected by drugs, and I quote, "And it has not only affected millions, but a lot of them are no longer viable as human beings in this planet." End of quote. On August 26, 2016, Mr. Duterte declared to a group of Filipino soldiers he visited in an army camp that, and I quote, "Crimes against humanity? In the first place, I'd like to be frank with you. Are they humans? What is your definition of a human being?" End of quote. These public speeches of Mr. Duterte serve to condition the Filipino people on the excuse for the murder of the victims of his anti-drug campaign and how the murders were taken out, brazen, execution style. These public speeches of Mr. Duterte were emblematic of findings that atrocity crimes were often preceded by the process of dehumanizing the identities of others to justify the crimes. Second, the murdered victims were dehumanized by how they were murdered. During their actual murders, the targeted victims were summarily accused as drug users or pushers without the benefit of a judicial process, just like the one before this chamber. The victims were then murdered inside their homes or within their own close-knit community. The victims who were murdered inside their homes were murdered in front of their family, their spouse, their children, or their parent, especially in front of their mothers. Some of the victims were forcefully separated from the physical clutches of their family members, protecting them from the direct perpetrators of Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign. This was what happened to the son of a victim in the early hours of a Thursday. At that time, this victim, her son, and her son's wife, who was pregnant and nearing delivery, were preparing to go to the hospital when 6 or 7 people dressed in black and who had guns suddenly entered their house. As recounted by this victim, and I quote, "My son kept repeating, 'Mama, don't leave me.' So I blocked the way. He pleaded again, saying, 'I will come with you, just don't kill me. Mama, don't leave me.' 4 officers were inside. One shouted at me, 'Get out of the way!' They pulled me down the stairs and yanked my hair. They had guns. My son pleaded again, 'Mama, don't leave me.' He was hugging, referring to his wife. They dragged me out into the street and put me on a motorcycle. Some victims begged the direct perpetrators for their lives, as witnessed by their family members. Some victims spontaneously took off their clothes to show to the direct perpetrators that they were clean. The home, which was supposed to be a shelter of security for the direct victims, became the crime scenes of their brazen murder. The targeting of the victims in their own homes is explained by the Philippine National Police Command Memorandum Circular number 16-2016, which was earlier referred to also by the prosecution. It was issued on July 1, 2016, by the then Chief of the Philippine National Police, Ronald Bato de la Rosa, appointed by Mr. Duterte. The relevant portion of CMC 16-2016 states that, and I quote, "The actual house-to-house visitations of suspected drug personalities shall be the highlight of Project Tonghang." End of quote. Project Tonghang refers to Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign on barangay clearance operations. Ultimately, the murdered victims were now known in their close-knit communities with the stigmatized label of natokhang and as drug users, despite the lack of any judicial declaration. Third, the murdered victims of Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign were further dehumanized even after their death by the false narrative of nanlaban. After the actual murder, the murdered victims were falsely portrayed as nanlaban, that they allegedly fought back against the police despite being the helpless victims. After the murder, evidence of illegal drugs and/or paltik guns were even planted on the murdered victims as part of the modus operandi of the anti-drug campaign to allegedly show that the victims purportedly fought back. Thus, the murdered victims were not only known as natokhang and as drug users, they were also now known in their close-knit communities with the false label of nanlaban, or someone who fought back. But for the surviving family members of the murdered victims, the suffered harms do not end there. The extreme trauma brought by the sudden murder of the Tokhang victims was further carried over to their surviving family members. Some of the surviving family members were even imprisoned and charged with fabricated criminal complaints while they were still grappling with the trauma of the sudden attack and the murder of their loved ones. For the victim I earlier referred to, after her son was forcefully separated from them, she and her son's pregnant wife were both arrested and detained in a police precinct. While under detention, she was told to get her son from the morgue. But they were not actually released from detention. They were actually photographed with the foils and rocks handed to them, and afterwards they were charged with fabricated complaints relating to illegal drugs, as that victim narrates. And I quote, "While in detention, I learned that the same thing had happened to all the other detainees. Their stories were the same. It took more than a year before this victim was released from imprisonment. The illegal imprisonment of surviving family members was part of the modus operandi to prevent the indirect victims from filing criminal complaints against the direct perpetrators of Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign. Thus, the document containing the charges in paragraph 19 refers to, and I quote, other violent crimes under Article 7.1, end of quote. Further, as the homes of the murdered Tokhang victims were the homes of multiple generations, how the murdered victims were brutally shot at have been traumatically witnessed by their family members, by their spouse, their children, or by their parents. This extreme trauma is a daily struggle for the surviving family members as they still live every day in the scene of the crime, their homes. This extreme trauma of the surviving family members also occurs when they see or about to encounter a police officer, or worse, the direct perpetrator in their community. But the extreme trauma of the surviving victims does not end there. The surviving victims were socially stigmatized in their close-knit communities with the label, "Natukhang sila," or "May natukhang sa kanila," which loosely translated means they have a family member killed in a tokhang operation. The surviving family members of the murdered victims were avoided and shunned in their close-knit community. The neighbors avoid the surviving family members, fearing for their own lives by reason of association with the murdered Tokhang victim. And the surviving family members usually mourn alone during the wake of their murdered loved ones. For some surviving family members who cannot endure this social isolation and continuing stigma, they eventually leave their close-knit community. The trauma and stigma are especially worse for the children of the murdered Tokhang victims. Aside from losing a parent, usually their father, who is the breadwinner, the children, as direct descendants of the murdered victims, were avoided at school or even bullied as the children of Natokhang. The children of the murdered Tokhang victims have to endure bullying, stigma, trauma, depression, and some even develop symptoms such as epilepsy. And because the murdered Tokhang victims were usually the breadwinners of their families, their death meant that their surviving family members were pushed toward further poverty. The surviving family members experienced extreme socio-economic dislocation with the murder of their breadwinner. Thus, Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign, aside from murdering victims from low-income communities, also brought about the breakdown of the families of the murdered victims. Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign destroyed the trust in the close-knit communities of the murdered Tokhang victims and ultimately destroyed the social fabric of these communities. Ultimately, Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign not only murdered people, but perpetrated state terror against low-income, marginalized communities across the Philippines. As a result, Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign shattered and terrorized these close-knit communities as a means of control. And ultimately, as the targeted victims of Mr. Duterte's drug war campaign were from marginalized, vulnerable communities, his drug war campaign was not really a war on drugs. It was a war against the poor. And the continued stigmatization of the indirect victims, the surviving family members, still persists until now. The children of the murdered victims are still suffering psychologically, mentally, and socio-economically. Their widowed mothers and their extended families, the grandparents, usually the grandmother, or aunts or uncles, also bear the burden of providing for the children of the murdered victims. And some surviving family members are still being visited or watched by the direct perpetrators to check on them. Last, what do these proceedings mean to the victims? The proceedings before this chamber are being watched intently by the victims because they see it as their first step towards the truth and towards justice. There is still a culture of denial that subsists even in the close-knit communities where the victims reside. The family members of the murdered victims still cannot openly discuss the murder of their loved ones in their close-knit communities. And some quarters supportive of Mr. Duterte even publicly claim that these murders under the drug war campaign allegedly never happened or were merely fake news or were justified as necessary. These hearings on the confirmation of charges are vital to the victims of Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign because it will be the first step for them in actualizing their right to the truth and to justice under international law. Madam President, Your Honors, the victims know that their murdered loved ones suffered under the charge of crimes against humanity for murder being charged against Mr. Duterte. Your Honors, the victims know, they have seen with their eyes, they have heard with their ears, and they have witnessed the barbarity of the murder wherein their loved ones' human dignity was never respected. Thus, the victims pray that this chamber confirm the charges for crimes against humanity for murder against Mr. Duterte for the sake of the truth and for the sake of justice for the victims. And so that the murderous legacy of Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign will not find new victims in the future. Madam President, Your Honors, thank you for your time and kind attention. This ends the submission of the common legal representative for victims. May it please the chamber.
Judge Motok.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Andres. I gather that you have finished. So this second day of our hearings has come to an end. In accordance with our schedule, the hearing is suspended until Thursday, 26 February at 10 in the morning. Thank you, parties, participants, our interpreters, the registry, technical staff, and all those who have worked on this hearing and allowed it to be held. I wish you a pleasant day, and we will see you on Thursday. The hearing is adjourned.